the last couple of weeks, we have been looking at the different aspects of this prophecy. And what we have been able to figure out is that it focuses primarily on two periods of time. First of all, it's referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. And secondly, it's referring to the final moments of time in the last days just before Jesus comes. And it's because this was the question that was asked by the disciples. And Jesus gave them the answer to the question in one continuous story without making it clear to them that there was this great gap of nearly 2,000 years between the first fulfillment and the second fulfillment. What I was looking at this week, and I'm going to spend a little time highlighting it this evening, I was looking at Luke 21. Luke 21 is a parallel passage. We have been looking at Matthew 24, but the parallel passage is Luke 21. And in the book of Luke, a part of what is in Matthew 24 is in Luke 17, and a part of it is in Luke 21. But when you look at Luke 21, it kind of gives you a clearer picture in some ways. So I'd like to just spend a little time and look at what it says in Luke 21 before we move on to the last part of Matthew 24. So I'm going to share my Bible. As a matter of fact, I should say before we go there, is there any question that anybody would like us to focus on first before we actually go into the Bible study? Any question, whether from last week or on any other topic? I always like to use the Bible study time that if there are any questions, we try to answer them. So just want to give you that opportunity if anybody has a question. Sister Lorena, go right ahead.
Thank you. Before you left just this afternoon, you said that when Noah and his children were saved, that Ham, I think you said, not really converted, but he believed. It's something like that. Can you repeat that and explain a little bit about that? Because I thought everyone who was saved at that time was because they believed.
Yes. I don't know. I can't say whether or not Ham was a believer. What I know is that you sometimes here if we look at it in a practical way, usually you find that children will respect their parents' decisions. And so it's quite possible that Ham went into the ark because his family was going, his mother, his father, his brothers. So Ham went along with them. So in this sense, he was kind of a believer, and he might have believed himself. Okay, I can't say he didn't believe, but what I'm saying is that the fact that they believed, it did not mean that they were righteous in the sense that they were people who were living upright lives. So why do I say this about Ham? Because shortly after the flood, we see the things that Ham did. He saw his father naked, and he did something to him. Now there is a difference of ideas about what he might have done to his father. The Bible just says he saw his father's nakedness and laughed at his father. He laughed at him or mocked him. Forget the exact words, but the point is, in the Jewish tradition, in Jewish traditions, it suggests that what he did was he sodomized his father. And when you look at the story, there is a lot to suggest that that is probably what happened, because it says when Noah awoke out of his wine, he knew what his son had done. So if he had just laughed at his father, how would the father wake up and know that he laughed at him? So he did something that when Noah woke up, he was aware of what he did to his father. So there was a lot of, according to the same Jewish traditions, there was a lot of homosexual lifestyle before the flood. According to them, it was the only time in the history of the world that men were actually writing marriage contracts to other men. The other time is our age. These are the only two ages that you have ever had men getting married to men, right before the flood and in our present generation. So it was a practice of the pre-flood world, and it seems like Ham had it in him when he came across to the other side of the flood. So this is why I'm saying that Ham didn't get on the ark because he was a good person. You know, it's clear from his behavior afterwards that he was not an upright person. And if you look at the history of his descendants, right after he did this, Noah said, "Cursed be Canaan." Now Canaan was the son of Ham. Ham did whatever he did to his father, and Noah's curse fell upon the son. And it wasn't Noah who was speaking; it was the Spirit of God speaking through Noah, because Noah can't curse anybody.
Right.
But why would God curse the son for what the father did? Because God is not like that. But a curse is just God's expression of how things will develop in the future. So what
Mm-hmm.
it shows me is that Ham's descendants followed in the ungodly line of their father. That's why they went away and they became the inhabitants of Canaan and they built the Tower of Babel. That line of people, Nimrod and those people, they were the descendants of Ham. So the father's attitude and lifestyle fell upon his children and his grandchildren. So it shows us that even although they got into the ark, they were not upright, good people in the sense that we understood that they behaved properly. And it emphasizes the point I was making that people got on the ark not because they were good, but because they believed that the flood was coming. So before the flood, the message was not about so much change your lives and live a better life. The message was a flood is coming. Prepare for it and and escape for your life. So it was a message based on believe what God says and get away. It wasn't a message that was saying stop your bad deeds and change your ways. No, it was a message that says God is going to destroy the world. Get on the ark and you will get away from it.
I see. Although you said that uh, the reason that he did that was so that those before those people like Methuselah and all those that died was to give the humanity another chance so that give them another chance when Jesus comes to the earth now they could be saved.
Yes,
Or however, if people who got on the ark who were like Ham, wouldn't the same thing repeat itself all over again, which in a sense it did?
exactly, Sister Lorena. It has. It has happened again. But the reason is that there had to be a way to preserve the Messiah. In other words, the whole history of the Bible, the reason why the Israelites were called, the reason why God has always tried to preserve a line of people. He wanted to preserve, there had to be a way for the coming of the Messiah. You see, the whole hope of the
Mm-hmm.
human race is the Messiah. So if God had allowed that rebellion before the flood to continue, no righteous would have been left. Nobody with faith would have been left. The entire planet would have gone completely evil, and everybody would have had to be destroyed. So what God did was save a few before it got to that place, and then he wiped out the rest of the human race, so he could find a few human beings through whom he would preserve the line that would bring the Messiah. Because you have to understand, the Messiah had to be a human being. Nobody who is not a human being could have saved the human race. It had to be somebody born of Adam's family who saves Adam's family. You can't save people unless you belong to that family. This is the law of corporate identity. We are lost in Adam, corporate identity. Somebody from Adam's lineage has to save the race because it was a human being that fell. It was a human being that Satan defeated. Only a human being could redeem us because it had to be a human being who conquered Satan and reversed the process. So because humanity had reached that place. I see you, Sister Esther. If you can, there's a little feedback. So if your mic is making noise, then you can just mute it until after I'm through. Um, so the point is that this is why God called people to get on the ark. So the people who got on the ark had some degree of faith. But after the flood, what we see again developing is two lines of people. We see the Babel builders, and we see evil beginning to multiply again. But out of it, this is why God called Abraham and his descendants. God isolated a group of people, and God said, through these people, the Messiah is going to come. So God tried to preserve the Hebrews. You saw how easily they got into apostasy. Over and over, God had to chastise them. Sometimes many of them had to die. Sometimes they had to be defeated. God was trying to preserve a set of people who would not go completely bad because he had to have a line of people through whom the Messiah would come. So this is the history of the world. He never had to destroy everybody again because that line was able to be preserved even in spite of all the apostasy until the Messiah came. And then, of course, since that time, we have had a Christian church which has been able to stand against the assaults of Satan, even though it has gone into apostasy and weakness and, in some cases, almost total darkness. But still, the Christian church has never been defeated. The Spirit of Christ has always preserved us that we have never got back to that place. But you know, Jesus says that in the last crisis, what is coming? No flesh would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days shall be shortened.
Mm,
Yeah.
yes. Thank you.
Okay, Sister Lorena. Sister Esther, you can go ahead and unmute.
Okay, this brings up something that I've been studying, puzzling over, and that is this idea of saving thy house. And I noticed that this happened at the time of the flood. It happened when Israel left Egypt. Anybody that was in their house went along, and it happened with Rahab, and you get the idea. I don't know if this is something you've studied, but if not, maybe you could. I'd be interested to know what you have to say about it.
Right. I have some thoughts on it immediately, and the thought is you have a double meaning to that emphasis in the Bible. A double meaning. First of all, a lot of things that happen in the Bible are types, or they are teaching tools. For example, we know that in the Old Testament, when it says a person would save his household, many times in the Old Testament it was speaking of physical saving. So people would be saved from physical death. It never referred to salvation in the sense of saving your soul eternally. Because, if you were saved from the enemy killing everybody in the house, if your house was protected, for example, in the time of the Exodus, when the angel of death passed over and the people who came into the house, they were not saved eternally. They were simply saved from physical death. When the death passed through and the Egyptian firstborn died and the Israelite firstborn lived, it was not salvation for eternity. It was not salvation from sin. It was salvation from the angel of death. It was salvation from the physical death that came upon Egypt. But it was a lesson. It was teaching a lesson. It was teaching that those who come into the family of faith in reality, in the antitype, we're talking about those who come under the blood of Jesus Christ. Every single person who comes under the blood of Jesus Christ will be saved eternally. So it was the representation that was pointing to the reality. Now, in the reality, nobody can be saved by simply coming into my house. No. A lot of heathen have passed through, and that doesn't mean they're saved. But my house, in a greater sense, is the house of Jesus Christ. The house and the family of Jesus Christ is my house. And anybody who comes into that house, the house and the family of Jesus Christ will be saved. This is the house that I have, that I offer people to come into. And when they come, they are saved because now the blood covers not only me, but those who have come into that household. So it's the principle of the type and the antitype. However, one last point. In 1 Corinthians 7, Paul says that if a woman is married to an unbeliever, and the unbeliever wants to stay with her, or vice versa, a man married to an unbelieving wife. He says, don't send away the unbeliever. Don't leave the unbeliever. If they want to go, let them go. But if they don't want to leave, let them stay, because he says the unbelieving is sanctified by the believing one. And what he really means is not that you can save that person, because God doesn't have any sons-in-law or daughters-in-law. He only has sons and daughters. So it doesn't mean you can save that person. What it means is that because you're a Christian and the person is in your environment, you can project a saving influence on the person. Your life can be such an influence that there is greater hope for the person than if you send the person away from your home. They are sanctified. It doesn't mean that they are saved. It means they are set apart. They are set apart for the special work of God, because they are under the umbrella of your influence. So in this sense also, being in your household can be a saving element, but not that you are saved by being there, but only that God's Spirit has greater access to you because there's a believer there with you. You can go ahead, Sister Esther.
So this, what you're just saying now, would apply to the situation then with Cornelius as well, when he was told that he would be saved and his house.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And to be, I mean, if we just think about the situation with Cornelius and the Philippian jailer, it says that the jailer and his family were baptized that night. Now, the thing is, the person who had the encounter with Paul in the jail was a jailer, and the person who had this unusual experience was Cornelius. But look, if a man has a vision, if Cornelius has a vision and an angel comes and tells him something, what do you think is the first thing he's going to do? If I have a vision tonight, what do you think is the first thing I'm going to do? Look here, my wife is knowing before she gets out of bed in the morning. And my children are the next persons I'm going to call. All of them, whether they live with me or not, I'm going to call them. So my children are going to be so stricken by what has happened to me. It's going to affect them. It's going to give them a strong opportunity for salvation, because usually the father of the family or the mother of a family has such a strong influence. And if you tell your child, if you have a normal relationship with your wife and your children, and you tell them, I had a vision from God last night, and God said this, what do you think your children are going to do? What do you think your wife is going to do? They are going to join with you in that decision to commit themselves to God. You know, I mean, this is how it is in a household which is a normal household, where there's respect for the parents and where there is some kind of harmony between husband and wife. Now, granted, we all understand that there are some families where there's such dislocation, and there's so much friction, and so much bad living, that you tell your wife that you had a vision and she will laugh at you. She doesn't believe anything you say. So it's not a guarantee that it will always be that way. But generally speaking, yes, the believer will have a great impact upon the other partner, especially if something happens to you like what happened to Cornelius, or like what happened to the Philippian jailer. I mean, he went home and told his family, look here, the men that were locked up, they are men of God. While they were singing, the whole prison shook to pieces, and the door opened, and what have you, and so forth. I think his wife and his children would have been sitting there with their mouths open, and they say, come, come, we're going with you to be baptized. So anyway, I think that's kind of like, yeah, you're quite right when you say, you know, Cornelius, you and your house will be saved today. Jesus said the same thing when he went to Zacchaeus' house. I think he said, today salvation has come to this house. The person who made the move was Zacchaeus, but his family his entire family was going to be impacted by what he did. And so yeah, so I think that is how it was, Sister Esther. Yes, Sister Lorena. Oh, okay. Your mic was just left on.
I do have a question, which is escaping me, but yeah, let someone else go, because it just escaped my mind.
No problem. I don't know if there's anybody else who has a question immediately, but if it comes back to your mind, then you can go right ahead. All right, Brother Steve.
Yes, Brother David. This question concerns the issue of sin. When you categorize sin the 4 sections, you said that the carnal mind is like, I will put it in my words, like the worst part or the most effective part of the sin process, whatever it is. Now, the Bible says in I think in 2 Corinthians 5:21 that he made him to be sin for us. God made Christ to be sin. Now, what aspect or what category or how far did it go with Jesus? Did he ever? We know that he didn't receive the carnal mind. He had the carnal mind at no time. But how would you place he becoming sin for us? Could you give me a little light on that?
Sure, Brother Steve, I can give you my thoughts on it. The 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 process of sin, if I may put it that way. Let me outline the process of sin as I understand the Bible to teach it. The end point of sin is transgression. It's doing wrong thing. It's behaving in the wrong way. Now, why do you behave in the wrong way? It's because you have a carnal mind. Why do you have a carnal mind? It's because you are separated from God. Why are you separated from God? It's because of unbelief. So the process of sin begins with unbelief. And I could even go a little further and I could say that the process of unbelief begins with misinformation about God. Okay, so it starts with bad ideas. So in the case of Satan, bad ideas came into his mind about God. That those came from himself, and he passed on these bad ideas to the angels. When those bad ideas were passed on, they stopped believing in God or they stopped trusting God. So sin started with bad information, but bad information doesn't mean that sin has come up, because we get bad information, but we don't accept it. So the bad information begins the process. But if you reject the bad information, fine. But if you accept the bad information, now you stop trusting God. Somebody tells you that God doesn't hear your prayer. Somebody tells you that God doesn't mean you well. You stop trusting God, unbelief. You don't allow God into your life. So you go to the next step in sin, which is separation from God or alienation from God. At this point, this is the key element of sin, separation from God. And that is where Jesus went. Now, why did Jesus end up separated from God? The thing is, Adam went through this process, and Lucifer went through this process. Bad information, unbelief, separation from God. That's the process Adam and Satan went through. You and I didn't start there. We did not go through bad information and unbelief. We were born in the state of separation. In our case, we were born into that condition. So we didn't start out like Satan or Adam. We were born in that condition. What about Jesus? Jesus was not born in that condition because he was the Son of God. And so, yet he had to take that condition. He had to take sin. And sin is a state of separation from God. So, how did it happen to Jesus? The Bible says the Lord laid it on him. The Lord has laid our iniquity upon him. When it says that sin was laid upon Jesus, God separated Christ from himself. This is how he became sin. He never suffered from unbelief. He never stopped believing in God. He never committed the act of transgression, the final stage of sin, but he was taken to the stage. God put him in the condition where he was separated from God. This is what had to happen to him in order for him to be tempted and tested as a human being. God separated him from himself. And so he died on the cross alone, separated from God. And that is how he was made to be sin.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome, Brother Steve. All right, so if there is no other question, we will go to Matthew 24. And as a matter of fact, we'll probably go to Luke 21 and just look at some of the things that we saw in Matthew 24 and see how they are expressed a little differently in Luke 21, giving us a little bit more insight. Now, before I even open the Bible, okay, Sister Lorena, go ahead before you forget, and then Sister Christine.
So sorry. In Daniel, I just wanted a very brief explanation of the 1,335 time in Daniel. It says, blessed are those who reach there.
Yes. Okay, you were asking about the 1335 days in Daniel. Um, it takes a long time to go into the details of what those days signify, and we I don't think we can go into the details this evening. But what I will tell you just briefly, the Adventists believe that those 1335 days actually. Sister Christina, I'm going to mute you until after. Okay, you can unmute. You can. I muted you, so you can unmute yourself after the answer because your mic is a bit noisy. Right. Adventists believe that the 1335 days ended in 1843, I believe, 43 and 44. But based on a revised examination of the prophecy, and I believe many others believe that these 1335 days apply at the end of time, a literal period at the end of time. And those 1335 days is something like 45 days after the end of the persecution of God's people. There are the 1260 days, and then the power of the holy people shall be scattered. The power of God's people, the end of the period of grace will come to an end. And then there will be a period of 45 days. And it says, blessed are those who come to that time. So this is just giving a brief overview of what I think it is. But we would have to go into greater detail, take a whole session to study it. So I can just give you that brief overview this evening, Sister Lorena.
Thank you so much. Yes.
You're welcome, Sister Lorena. Sister Christina, you can go ahead if you can unmute your mic. I don't know if you're trying to unmute. I don't know if I messed you up by muting you, but I'm not hearing you at all, and I'm not seeing green for your microphone. I don't know. All right, if you're trying to say something, Sister Christina, I would suggest that maybe you have to restart your device and then come back again and try again. All right. Okay. So I wanted to make a comment before we actually go back to the prophecy concerning the coming of Jesus in Matthew 24. And what I'm going to point out is that we have the same record in Matthew 24, in Luke 13, in Mark 13, and in Luke chapter 21. Now, these three records were written by three different people. And so you find that in some cases there are slight differences. And many people look at these differences and they say, you see, the Bible is not trustworthy because there are differences. But in actual fact, I'm going to give you a different perspective. All right. If Brother Howard and I were together on Thursday, we were in a certain place praying for a certain person. Now, if you were to ask Brother Howard, what happened on Thursday, Brother Howard? I guarantee you that if you ask me afterwards, I'm going to tell you a little bit differently. I can guarantee that. And it's not that Brother Howard is lying or that I am lying. It's that different people remember different details. And also different people, because you have a different emphasis in your mind, you focus more on some things than another person. So when you talk to two honest people and you ask them about something and they give you stories that are slightly different, it doesn't mean that one of them is a liar. It simply means that because we are human beings and we see things from a different perspective, different people remember different details. And I'm sure you all understand what I'm saying very well. So when it comes to the Bible and to the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and you find that there are differences sometimes in the way things are presented, it's not an indication that the Bible is untrustworthy. It's an indication that It is very trustworthy because different people from different times and different situations come together and they tell a story that is so similar. The little details that seem to be different is simply means that you are getting a broader view of the story. One person is telling you what he sees or what he remembers, and the other person is telling you what he remembers. Now, in the case of the book of Luke, I'll tell you, Luke was not there when Jesus was on the earth. He was not there. Luke was a Gentile. He actually wrote the book of Acts, but he was a historian. So, what Luke did, from what we understand, Luke collected the story of Jesus. When he became a Christian, he was a friend of Paul. He used to travel around with the Apostle Paul. He's the one who wrote the Acts of the Apostles, and he also wrote the Gospel of Luke. So there was a Roman gentleman, a gentleman by the name of Theophilus. He was a Roman official who actually was interested in the gospel or actually became a Christian. And so Luke, knowing this man, wrote the book of Luke and he wrote the book of Acts and he sent it to this gentleman. If you look at the beginning of the book of Luke and the beginning of the book of Acts, you will see where it is addressed to somebody named Theophilus, and he calls him most excellent Theophilus. He was a he was a governing official, somebody of high rank. And so Luke wrote the books of Luke and Acts to help this man to understand the details of Christianity. So you might ask, where did Luke get his story from? Now, sometimes we think that every book that is in the Bible, God gave somebody a vision. But that's not true. What God did was, these books, many of them were written by godly people. And God inspired them in the sense that while they were writing, the Spirit of God was guiding their hand and reminding them of the things that they should write. But it was not like it was a divine dictation where every word, God was controlling every word. I used to believe that the Bible was like this. And this is why I used to believe in what we call verbal inspiration. I don't believe in verbal inspiration anymore. Verbal inspiration is when you have a secretary and you are dictating and you say, you write and the secretary is taking shorthand or every word that you say is being written down. That's verbal dictation. I don't believe God said to Luke, Luke, take a letter. And he spoke a sentence and then Luke wrote it and he spoke another sentence and Luke wrote it. No, the book of Luke wasn't written like that. It was based on God. It was inspired in the sense that I even feel that I myself am inspired sometimes in this way. How inspired in what way? Because sometimes I'm writing and I feel like, God is putting ideas in my mind. And I feel like I'm seeing the scriptures come together in a particular way and I'm putting things down. I feel like this is inspiration, but I would not say it is like prophetic inspiration at all. It's just that the Spirit of God is working to bring ideas to your mind and to remind you of things. And I believe this is what it means, that many of these biblical books were inspired. God had people who belonged to him. They were his people. And what they were writing was the truth. And God inspired them, gave them the thoughts, focused their minds so they could write down things. But there is still that human element in these things that were written. So what we have in the book of Luke, the reason why the book of Luke is a little different from the book of Matthew and Mark is that Luke was collecting his story from people who knew Jesus, people who were there on the spot and knew the story of Jesus. They told Luke what happened, and Luke wrote it down, and it became his book. So Luke was not an eyewitness, but he heard from eyewitnesses. And so because of this, if you look at the book of Luke, remember I said that what you find in Matthew 24, you're not going to find it completely in Luke 21. A part of it is in Luke chapter 17, and then you have chapter 18, and then a part of it is in Luke 21. You have a gap between 17 and 21. It's the same information, but in the book of Luke, it's not in one place. If you read the book of Luke and you read the Bible carefully, you will see that there are a few places like this in Luke. So if you wonder about it, this is the way. This is how you can explain it. Luke's book is a collection of pieces of information from people who were there. You know what I think is most remarkable when I read it? Let me tell you what I think is most remarkable. When you read, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, don't you wonder that they remembered all those details? I mean, how many of you know the Bible like you could quote Matthew chapter 5 by heart? You know, these people, they said Jesus went out and he told a parable and he said this, and they give you almost the exact words. Matthew chapter 5, 6, 7, they are giving you the exact words, and this is years afterwards. I'm amazed because if I go and listen to us, okay, most of you heard Brother Howard preaching this morning, and you heard me preach this morning. How many of you remember the words that I used? Do you remember anything at all? You might remember the basic ideas, but to remember the words, and yet years after Jesus was gone, these people could come back and they wrote down the words that he spoke. I mean, to me, this is amazing. To me, this is the evidence of the Spirit of God working on these people. If you look at Acts chapter 7, for example, remember when Stephen was stoned to death? Or if you look at Acts chapter 2, Peter's sermon on the day of Pentecost, or Acts chapter 5, Peter's sermon at the temple afterwards. Read those sermons. The sermon of Stephen takes up one whole page or more in your Bible. Stephen was preaching and he was about to be stoned to death and he was preaching. Luke has the whole sermon written out word by word by word. You say, where on earth did they get this from? They had no recording device. They didn't have a secretary taking down the words. Can you see that? There was inspiration that the Spirit of God was giving them memories that were almost like a computer, like a recording device. Because these words, they could remember them so exactly that they could repeat it to Luke, that Luke could write it down in his book and say, this is a sermon that Stephen preached. This is a sermon that Paul preached. And the record is there in detail. I think it is most amazing. Things like this really, really give me confidence in the Bible, because I can see from this that it is not a normal book. It's not a human book, but it's a book that is divinely put together. So having said that, I will now go on to Luke chapter 21. Matthew 24 compared with Luke 21. Let me go to Luke 21, chapter 21 here. All right, Luke 21. In the right panel, I'm going to just touch back on some of the things that we looked at in Matthew 24. Look at what Luke says. Let me begin from verse 10. Verse 9. We looked at this in Matthew 24. Let's look at it in Luke 21. But when you shall hear of wars and commotions, be not terrified. For these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. We emphasize this, that Jesus told us that these things were not the signs of the end, because he said these are the beginning of sorrows. Notice how Luke puts it. He puts it differently. He says, these things must first come to pass, but the end is not by and by. The words are a little different, but the meaning is the same. Then said he unto them, nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And great earthquakes shall be in divers places, and famines, and pestilences, and fearful sights, and great signs shall there be from heaven. So he now seems to be speaking about the end time events, just like we saw in Matthew 24. But then he goes back now, and where Matthew speaks about the great tribulation, this is what he says. Where Matthew talks about God's people being persecuted, he says, but before all these, they shall lay their hands on you and persecute you, delivering you up to the synagogues and into prisons, being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. And in fact, this is not the great tribulation. This is the tribulation that took place of the early church. He's still focused on the early church. This is when they were brought, like Paul was brought before Caesar, and Peter was brought before the Sanhedrin and beaten, and God's people were badly persecuted in those days. And it shall turn to you for a testimony. It becomes an opportunity to testify. Settle it therefore in your hearts not to meditate before what you shall answer. So Jesus said, and this is something Matthew doesn't mention, not in this spot, but Jesus says, you know what, hold on a second. I said Matthew didn't mention this, but I wanted to look at where Matthew actually mentions it. Luke puts it here in Luke 21. But look at Matthew 10, because Jesus said something just like this in Matthew 10. Yeah, it's a part of the sermon in Matthew 10. Luke put it in Matthew 24. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew 10. But beware of men, for they will deliver you up to the councils, and they will scourge you in their synagogues. Luke puts it right here. Delivering you up to the synagogues, into prisons, and being brought before kings and rulers for my name's sake. In Matthew 24, Jesus says, and you shall be brought before governors and kings for my sake, for a testimony against them and the Gentiles. Luke says, it shall turn to you for a testimony. In, Matthew says, but when they deliver you up, take no thought how or what you shall speak, for it shall be given you in that same hour what you speak. Luke says, settle it therefore in your hearts not to meditate before what you shall answer, for I will give you a mouth and wisdom which all your adversaries shall not be able to resist. Matthew says, and the brother shall deliver up the brother to death, and the father the child, and the children shall rise up against their parents and cause them to be put to death. And you shall be hated of all men for my name's sake, but he that shall endure to the end shall be saved. Luke puts it here in Luke 21. You shall be betrayed by parents, brethren, kinsfolk, and so on. You shall be hated by all men for my name's sake. So, I don't know if you are seeing what I'm seeing, but when did Jesus say this according to Matthew? According to Matthew, Jesus said it when he sent out the 12 disciples and he gave them power against all manner of unclean spirits. This is when Jesus actually spoke these words. Now, Luke is getting the story secondhand. And so Luke gives you the same message, but he puts it in a different context. He puts it in the context of Jesus' sermon when he was talking about the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, would you say that this is false because it's in a different place? No, I wouldn't say so, because look here. The same exact thing happened in that period of time. It was happening at that period of time. So the words that are spoken here by Jesus, according to Matthew, they were spoken sometime before. Even though Luke puts it at this spot, it is still the truth, because this is exactly where it applied. It was fulfilled in this time of the destruction of Jerusalem. I hope you're understanding what I'm saying, and if you're not, you're welcome to stop me. So Luke puts all of this statement right down at this time, just before the destruction of Jerusalem. And when Jesus told it to his disciples, he just told them that this was coming in Matthew 10. He just told them that all this would happen. But he never told them exactly when, but he said this is what would happen because of their preaching the gospel. So Luke took it and Luke put it at the time of the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, see what Jesus says. That shows you that this is the time he's talking about. He says in verse 20, Luke says in verse 20, Luke tells the story, and in verse 20 it says, and when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. We already saw that Matthew expresses this in Matthew 24. And Matthew says, when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. This is what Matthew says. And Luke puts it another way. He says, when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies. Now, if you ask me, why does Luke put it that way? Because I stopped doing those things. No, you stop here or whatever. Right? Okay, Daniel, I think your business is all over the place. You have to keep your mic muted. So it says, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. And you might ask, why did Luke put it in this way? And I'll tell you why. It's because the people who lived in that time, they understood the prophecy. Jesus says, when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet. And the people understood that what he meant was that Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies. And so when they told the story to Luke, they gave him the meaning. When you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then you can know that it is about to be destroyed. So you can see that the prophecy now begins to go parallel. Jesus says at that point, let those which are in Judea flee to the mountains. And Luke says the same thing. Those are in Judea flee to the mountains, and so forth. For these are the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled. But woe be unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, for there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon these people. Now, Luke gives you a bit more information here than Matthew. And when Matthew says there shall be great tribulation, remember last time we were looking at this, I pointed out that the Jews saw this as being fulfilled in the destruction of Jerusalem, even though we understand that there is another fulfillment at the end of time, which will be the greatest of all. But if you were a Jew living in Jerusalem at the time when it was destroyed, you would have seen this as the greatest tribulation. When you saw women eating their own babies, woe to them that give suck in those days. For there shall be great distress in the land and wrath upon these people. So you can see where Luke is applying it to the destruction of Jerusalem. In Matthew, the way Jesus said it originally, it covers, it can be applied to both the destruction of Jerusalem as well as the end of the world. Now, Luke goes on to say, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and shall be led away captive into all nations. And then he makes this strange statement. And to be honest, I don't know, I still am not quite sure how to interpret this statement. Because it says, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled. This is strange because you don't find it in the book of Matthew. You don't find it in the book of Mark. You only find it here in the book of Luke. And because of this statement, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, this is one of the prophecies that has received a whole lot of interpretations. The people who believe that the Jews are still God's special people, they believe that the city of Jerusalem was to be controlled by Gentiles until there was a certain time called the times of the Gentiles, and when it was fulfilled, then the Jews would go back to Jerusalem. So many people believe that this happened back in the 1940s when the Jews returned to Jerusalem, when the United States and Britain set aside that part of the world as the homeland of the Jews, and the Jews started to go back to Palestine and to rebuild Jerusalem. They say that that is the fulfillment of the times of the Gentiles, and they believe that this is a sign of the end. So you hear a lot of these evangelical prophets and Bible students telling you about the time of the Gentiles being fulfilled in the 1940s, some point to the 1960s when they had a war where they overthrew some of the Arab nations, and they say this was the fulfillment of the time of the Gentiles. But the prophecy is not so simply interpreted, because we know that the Jews are no longer the special people of God. And if we believe the Bible, they will never again be, as a people, the special people of God. The Jews, God will never go back to favoring one race above another, one nation above another. God will never go back to that. We understand that today, God's people are a spiritual people, not a physical people. We understand that physical Jerusalem and physical Palestine has no place at all in God's plan. They have no place at all in God's work of salvation. They are just places like everywhere else on the world. So we look at this prophecy and ask, what is the meaning of it? Now, here is why it is difficult. When Jesus said in the same verse, verse 24, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and they shall be led away captive into all nations. Is he speaking about physical Jerusalem? If you look at the context, it seems clear that he's speaking about physical Jerusalem, because he says, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you can know that the desolation is nigh. So he's talking about physical Jerusalem. And he does not change. He goes down. Woe be to them that are with suck and with are with child, and to them that give suck. He goes on and he says, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword, and they shall be led away captive into all nations. He's speaking of the physical Jews and physical Jerusalem. And then right in the midst of that sentence, he just puts the scene. And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. It's hard to believe he's not speaking about the same Jerusalem that he just mentioned in verse 20. Does he suddenly switch to a different Jerusalem? Because he's talking about Jerusalem being destroyed and the people of Jerusalem being led away into all nations. And then he says, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles. And this is why the prophecy, as I said, is a difficult prophecy, because it is tempting to believe that Jesus just switches and he starts talking about spiritual Jerusalem. But if you were to say this to if you were to say this to an evangelical or somebody who believes it's talking about literal Jerusalem, they will say to you, look at the thing in context. They will say you are denying the context of the passage. They will say the passage is showing you that it's speaking of physical Jerusalem. Now, is there any reason to believe that it's speaking about spiritual Jerusalem in spite of the context? I hope you're following me, because I know that it's a little
No.
difficult when when we are just speaking like this and you're not looking at a picture or something. But I'm going to take you to another passage which might lead us to the conclusion that it's speaking of spiritual Jerusalem. In the middle of the sentence, there's a switch, and it switches from physical Jerusalem to spiritual Jerusalem. I'm going to show you a passage that leads us in that direction.
But David, before you go to that passage,
Yes.
what if Jesus was trying to say, look, um, speaking about physical Jerusalem here, to say that for a period of time, the Gentiles, they were known at that time, is going to trample this place down for a period of time. What if he was trying to say? Because if he was to prophesy anything about Jerusalem being trampled or being kept down, destroyed and kept down for a period of time, how would he put it? Because telling the people, the people speaking of only understood Jews and Gentiles in the physical sense. They never understood it in the spiritual sense then. So which other way could he have put it to prophesy that something like this would happen?
Yeah, I understand what you're saying. So you're saying it may be simply just a prophecy that is giving a time element to say this will happen. But here's the problem with that interpretation. It means that if he talks about the times of the Gentiles being fulfilled, he's suggesting that the Gentiles have been given a certain time, and when the time is over, it goes back to the time of the Jews. If he talks about the times of the Gentiles, it means that as a part of the prophecy, he's saying that the Jews and Jerusalem have some special relationship which is going to be broken until the Gentiles' time is up, and then the Jews, in God's plan, the Jews will go back to Jerusalem. Otherwise, there's no point in mentioning the event at all.
I think that thought is a little bit flavored based on our background. I think that if he was saying, look, this place is going to be trampled down and destroyed, and until a period of time where the Gentile message is going to go out to the Gentiles. So because Jerusalem is destroyed and the people have to scatter, and because of that, they're going to take the message to the Gentiles. Then after a period of time, the Jews, they're going to come back to Jerusalem, yes, but not as a special people necessarily, just as
Why
a race.
why mention it? Why is it important?
Well, if he's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, it's not going to permanent. It's not like Babylon, where the Bible says that Babylon will never be inhabited again. So he's just saying, he's just probably just telling them what is going to happen.
The
I
thing
just think
is
that
that
just being physical,
the whole point of this prophecy is because Jesus is trying to give his people an idea of the things that will happen to them, and they're concerned about the destruction of the temple and the end of the world. So either he's saying that these things will have some kind of impact on you. The thing is, when he says that Jerusalem, one stone shall not be left upon another, that shall not be cast down, when that is fulfilled, there's no point in continuing to talk about Jerusalem, because that is the question they ask. When shall these things be? So he talks about the destruction of Jerusalem. If you return to Jerusalem, you are creating the impression that there's some further value or meaning or point to Jerusalem. When the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled, if we are talking about a time when the Jews go back to Jerusalem, is that a sign of the end?
Well, I mean, I don't know if I can say it's a sign of the end, but it could be something that we should consider before the end comes, because here we have it. The Jews are back down in Jerusalem and they occupy the place again. So it
If
can
it's not,
come to pass.
I know, but if it's not a sign of the end, it is meaningless. There's no point to it.
Well, Jesus spoke about many things that would occur before the end came, before the end comes, right? He speaks about earthquake, he speaks about people doing all kind of different things before the end come, and then he tells us must look out for certain signs and start to look up. We see that in other chapters. So what if he was just giving us a history of what is going, because obviously the disciples were curious. They wanted to know what was going to be the fate of this place.
All
So
right.
what if he was
Okay.
just giving them a panoramic view or a timeline view of what was going to occur? I'm just saying, you know.
Yeah. My objection is that if it doesn't have any effect on the history of God's people or on the prophecy itself, to me it's just a curiosity. It's like God almost just throws in something for our curiosity. And there's another prophecy I want to bring in to look at to show you why we could entertain the idea that it may be speaking about spiritual Jerusalem, even in spite of the fact that it is so much out of context. I see Sister Esther wants to say something. Let me just bring in the other prophecy, and then I'll let Sister Esther go ahead. And I'm actually going to Revelation 11, because in Revelation 11 there is a passage that is amazingly, strikingly like the one we have here in Luke. And look what it says. It talks about, after John is given this reed like a rod, and the angel tells him to rise and measure the temple of God and the altar and them that worship therein. This is clearly not a physical thing. This is measuring the heavenly temple, the people of God, the church of God. But it says, but the court which is without the temple, leave out and measure it not. Look at what it says. For it is given unto the Gentiles, and the holy city shall they tread underfoot 40 and 2 months. Here you have a time that is given to the Gentiles, okay? They are given 40 and 2 months to tread down the holy city. So you can see that you could conclude that the time of the Gentiles is this 42 months. If you put the two prophecies together, you actually come up with something that fits, that seems to fit very well. So what I'm saying is that in the book of Luke, this statement being dropped in right here in the middle of nowhere, and I say in the middle of nowhere because if you go to Matthew, it is not there, and Matthew was on the spot. And if you go to Mark, it is not there. And it is believed that Mark wrote after Matthew. But anyway, Mark's book is very much like the book of Luke. John doesn't mention it, but Luke brings it in. And Luke is actually the person who was not on the spot. He got this information from other people. So it could be that the information that Luke got has to do with this other statement here. It has to do with the spiritual Jerusalem. But just like he did a little earlier on, Luke put it in at this spot. It could be. I'm not saying it is so, because I want to be very cautious when I'm putting this kind of speculation about the Bible. But at the same time, the closest thing you can find in the Bible to this statement in Luke 21, you'll not find anything that fits better than Revelation 11 here, where it's clearly talking about spiritual Jerusalem and not physical Jerusalem. So these two passages put together would make me think that in spite of the fact that this seems to be speaking of the physical Jerusalem, I would accept that it's referring to spiritual Jerusalem that is going to be trodden down of the Gentiles for a certain time. All right, even though it doesn't fit contextually, it doesn't seem to. But a lot of what is in Luke, as I said, is not in the exact context because Luke was writing down what he learned from other people, eyewitnesses. Sister Esther, you can go ahead.
I just wanted to know if you have any information or if you ever heard of William Grothier.
I used to I know that he's a friend of Alan Stump. Alan Stump used to work with him many years ago. I used to get his his paper, his thought paper,
So
and
you're familiar with what he taught.
I wasn't very intimately acquainted with his ideas, but through Alan Stump, I came to understand that he believed that the time of the Gentiles were fulfilled sometime in the 60s, if I'm right.
No, it was 1980.
1980, okay, and so he believed that at that time the probation of Adventism was closed, something like that.
No, not exactly. George and I worked for him too, by the way. So
Okay,
he believed that the generation that saw the sign would see the coming of the Lord. I don't
okay,
know. I don't know about it. What constitutes a generation? It's different for everybody, seems to me. But anyway, that I didn't know if that had any bearing on it at all or not.
yeah, I remember having some kind of discussions with Alan Stump about it. I don't remember the details, but yes, something like that. So his belief was that what the prophecy is saying. I mean, he was reading things into the statement that are not actually there because it says, "And Jerusalem shall be trodden down of the Gentiles until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled." And so, in his thinking, when these times of the Gentiles were fulfilled, then those who live to see it would not die before Jesus comes again. So he was using it as a marker to say that this means it's the end of the world. But if you look at the statement, there's nothing in the statement that really says this. In my opinion, this is kind of like, one of those cases where you're reading into the Bible what you want it to say instead of what it actually says. So could you just, if you remember, Sister Esther, what was it that happened in 1980 that he says was the fulfillment of this?
Actually, I don't remember. I remember that there were like 3 events. One of them was it 1946 or something where Jerusalem, just different things, and then I think it was 1980 that the I'm sorry, my brain isn't that clear, but is
I
it
understand.
that
I have
they moved the what is that,
General
George?
Conference headquarters.
1980, the Jews moved what's the word? Their capital. They moved their capital there.
Okay,
And
okay,
see that um and pardon? Yeah, the Knesset. That's what the word I was looking for. And the other things in Luke 21 also, the generation that saw that sign saw the fulfillment is the way he put it.
okay. All right, thanks. So anyway, it highlights the point that there are quite a number of interpretations to these times of the Gentiles. But basically, the idea is that the times of the Gentiles is a time period that we are being given. And like Jesus was saying, when this time period is over, he doesn't say what it indicates, but they will read into it that he's saying that when this time period is over, it's time for, well, the evangelicals say it's time for the Jews' time again. God is going to go back to dealing with the Jews. They believe that the Gentiles were given a period, and that period was from the time of the apostolic church until down at the end of time, when God will be finished with the Gentile church and they will be raptured away. And then God will go back to dealing with the Jews and they become his people again. And they refer to this as the times of the Gentiles. But and it says that they will trample down Jerusalem. Jerusalem will continue to be harassed by these so-called Gentiles until this. It's a very Old Testament kind of view of the prophecy. And then, as Sister Esther pointed out, there are some people in independent Adventism. William Grothier was one, and Alan Stump believed it, that the fact that Jerusalem was once again in the hands of Jews was a strong indication that we were in the last generation. But anyway,
Brother David,
Brother David,
your father,
Brother A and then Brother Ayayi.
yeah, your father, Daddy Clayton, had something that he had predicted that the Jews were going to go back to Jerusalem, or they were going to go set up their sovereignty back there based on something he read that he pointed out to some of his colleagues earlier in his ministry. And he was saying, he had mentioned it at some time. I don't know what the time period between what the markers of time that they are using to determine this 42 months, because Revelation speaks about 42 months. What's the marker of time, or how could it fit in any of these dates that they have when the Jews went back to Jerusalem? Is there any coincidence or any time period that seems to fit with it? Could it be that Jesus was given a twofold prophecy?
No, the evangelicals believe it will happen after the rapture. There will be 7 years. 7 years is 42 months. They believe that for 7 years the Jews will go back to being God's special people, and so for them the 42 months is in the future, and it will commence with the rapture of the Gentile church. My father, as I understood it, he was reading from Ezekiel 37 where it talks about in the last days God will gather together his people and so forth, and he shall put them back in the land. He was interpreting Ezekiel 36 and 37 and those prophecies in a literal way as to be fulfilled, because the prophecies are really very detailed and they seem to be focused very much on the regathering of physical Israel. Like he said, I will gather you from all lands where you were scattered. I look at the same prophecies and I look at it in a spiritual way. I look at it as from a new covenant perspective, and I'm saying even though it's written in physical wording for physical people, we have to apply the new covenant understanding. So I don't see that it applied today, even though when the Jewish nation was gathered together again back in the 1940s, that is where my father concluded. He said to his friends that he said it before it actually happened, and when it happened, he said to them it was a fulfillment, and some of them actually were convinced. But I heard about he shared this with me many years afterwards, and I wasn't persuaded, and I still am not persuaded. Sanya says 42 months. How does that work out to 7 years? Let me see. 12, 7 12s. Yeah, it doesn't fit, does it? 12, 60 days. Oh, 3.5 years. 3.5 years. It's the middle of the 7 years. So they say that for 7 years, the Antichrist will 3, 12, 36 and a half, 42. Yeah, 42 months. That's 3.5 years. They say that for 7 years, God will go back to dealing with the Jews. And for the first 3.5 years, the Jews are going to be persecuted by the Antichrist. Or it's the last 3.5 years. For the first 3.5 years, the Antichrist will be friends with the Jews. And then in the middle of that week, in the middle of the 7 years, he will break his covenant with the Jews, and he will start persecuting the Jews for 3.5 years. This is what I believe. Daniel, you're unmuted again. Let me mute you. Okay, so yes. Go ahead, Brother Ayayi.
well, Brother David, if we will live like we are talking about physical Jerusalem, and then we go to the spiritual Jerusalem here, I just think it doesn't fit the account of what Christ is saying, because based on Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, is where is spoken about the desolation of Jerusalem, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, and in the Amplified Bible, if I read, it says that, and he shall make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wind of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So I think if it says here, until the times of the Gentiles be fulfilled, I'm thinking the time of the one who come to desolate Jerusalem, which is the Roman Empire.
Hmm.
Yeah, and Jerusalem shall be trodden down by Gentiles. And the Romans were the Gentiles who have trodden down Jerusalem, and their time been fulfilled. That means that when they finish their work, there is time also determined for them that they will be destroyed also. So how can we be taking it as a spiritual Jerusalem? That's my
Okay. You know, Brother Ayayi, it's the first time I'm hearing that perspective, and to me, it's worth looking at. Okay. The thing is, as I pointed out before, when I look at the context, it's hard for me to put it into spiritual Jerusalem, even though, you know, it's because I don't see any other interpretation. I say maybe the spiritual interpretation is really the correct thing, because I can't find a physical fulfillment. But as you pointed out, the whole prophecy is looking at physical Jerusalem. I just never thought of Daniel 9 in connection with this prophecy. But as you pointed it out here now, it really makes sense to me, and it's something that we probably should take into consideration, something I want to look at more closely, because it is true. In context, it's talking about the destruction of Jerusalem by the Romans. They were the Gentiles who overthrew Jerusalem, and they dominated and controlled Jerusalem until their time was up. So that's an interesting approach. I'm going to say it seems to make sense, and I will bear it in mind and look at it more closely. I won't say anything conclusive this evening because I need to look at it more. But to me, it makes sense. It makes sense. All right. So thank you for that input. Anyway, and the reason why it makes so much sense, all of you can understand. If you look at the whole prophecy, there's nothing in the prophecy that is a spiritual application. It just seems a little strange that this one sentence in the whole prophecy should have a spiritual application and everything else is physical. That's why I'm so willing to jump onto Brother Ayayi's explanation, because it kind of makes sense, you know. We don't have to do any harm to the prophecy or to abuse the principle of context and all of that. So I hope you can all understand why I'm saying it makes sense. So it continues in verse 25. And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars. So we had that in Matthew 24. Let me go back to Matthew 24 over here so we can keep them parallel. Yeah, Jesus said the same thing. So Jesus said, immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be dark and the moon shall not give her light. And in Luke, it skips out this great tribulation. But yet it doesn't skip it out, because Luke sees this great tribulation as the destruction of Jerusalem. Right? But because Matthew gives you both prophecies in one, we understand that Matthew is speaking about the last great tribulation at the end of time. Luke doesn't mention that last great tribulation. He just talks about Jerusalem being destroyed and being trodden down, and then he jumps immediately to the end. There's a gap here in the book of Luke. It says, and there shall be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars. But now he gives us some details that we don't see in Matthew. It says, upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring. You know, he even talks about the condition in the cosmic arena, in the natural world. Even the sea itself, he says, is going to be a sign. And I think the way we can apply this, we can look at the tidal waves. We can look at the hurricanes. You know, people are there's going to be more natural disasters than the earth is accustomed to seeing, to the point where it says, upon the earth there'll be distress of nations, and then he adds, with perplexity. And the word perplexity means you're looking for a solution and you can't find it. To be perplexed means you're in a situation where you cannot understand or you cannot see a solution. So he's talking about a time like the time in which we are living. Okay, there are some of the things that people say are taking place today that we can say they are fantasies. Okay, I know some people believe that the ozone layer is being eroded. Some people believe that there's global warming. Some people believe that the polar ice caps are melting. Some people say it's nonsense, right? I don't know. I know that the Bible says that man is destroying the earth and God will destroy those who destroy the earth. So I'm not going to be quick to discard some of these things, because really, according to the Bible, there are going to be natural a natural condition of things where the earth begins to fall apart, to the point where it says that there will be distress of nations with perplexity. Nobody is able to see an answer. It says men's hearts will be failing them for fear. And you know, I remember many years ago, there was a satellite that fell from the sky. Okay. The Russians, I believe, are one of these nations, put up a satellite, and they discovered they lost control of it. And it was in the news that the satellite was going to fall. And of course, when you look up in the sky and you see these satellites, they're just little dots of light moving, but they're actually huge things, okay? And when it was understood that this thing was going to fall back to Earth, there was a lot of alarm. And I remember a news article where they say a man woke up in his sleep crying, Skylab, Skylab. That was the name of the satellite. He woke up out of his sleep saying, Skylab, Skylab, and had an heart attack and died. So when I heard that, I always remember this statement here in Luke where it says, men's hearts failing them for fear. A lot of the time when you hear people have heart attacks, it's not so much because of natural disasters or because of these cosmic events, but what Jesus says is that they're going to get to the place where, for the very fear of these things, people live in fear, and it will kill people. Men will have heart attack, hearts fail them, whether it means literal heart attack or not, but it's going to be a terrible condition of things, and we can see it coming up on the earth right now. Failing them for fear and for looking after those things which are coming on the earth. Now, here it is. I don't think we're fully there yet, because it says, for the powers of the heavens shall be shaken. Every now and then you hear that there is potentially some heavenly body heading towards earth. Every now and then you hear about, they say they have discovered what they call Planet X. The scientists say they have discovered the presence of another planet in the solar system that they call Planet X. And it's strange because they say they have not been able to see this planet, but they say they have been able to detect the presence of the planet based on certain of their instruments and what their instruments are showing. But they are speculating. Here's what they are speculating. They are speculating that this planet, sometime in the past, came close to the Earth, and it created an event, a disastrous event that wiped out the dinosaurs and the animals that used to live back then, and wiped out the earth and caused what they call an ice age. Now we know that the dinosaurs were destroyed during the flood, and we know that what they call the ice age was what happened after the flood, because of the flood. Now I don't know if when the flood came, there really was a heavenly body that came close to planet Earth. I suspect it happened, because something happened to drag Earth out of orbit. And I'm speaking as somebody who believes in a global Earth, all right, and the solar system and the rest of it. Something happened to drag Earth out of its orbit. The Bible says in the last days, when the earth falls apart again, it says, the earth shall reel to and fro like a drunkard, and the earth shall be turned upside down. Now we know that the earth follows a cycle, a carefully prepared cycle, where it moves in a steady orbit night and day. If it moves a little bit out of that orbit, terrible disasters can happen, because the balance between the gravitational forces of Earth and Sun are so finely tuned. If it moves a little bit, terrible things will happen on this planet. Great earthquakes, storms, hurricanes, tidal waves, all kinds of things will happen. We know enough to understand that just the movement of the moon. I don't know if people disbelieve this, but I live by the seaside and I saw it to be true. Every night the tide comes in. Every day the tide goes out. In the night it comes back in. And when I say the tide, I don't mean the waves. For you who don't understand the tide, the level of the sea rises sometimes by 4 or 5 feet every evening. And in the morning it goes back out. It drops back down. When I used to go to school, the school I went to was right on the seaside. They call it Barrack School. And the yard, there was a little wall at the edge of the schoolyard, and the sea was on the side of that wall. And we children used to go out when the tide went out. When the tide went out, we used to go out and walk on the sand and catch crabs and little fish that got caught when the tide went out. And then when it was coming back in, you had to get back off, otherwise you would get wet. And you can read stories of people getting trapped. They go to a little island and then the tide comes in and they are trapped. They can't move. And if they, sometimes the tide might rise so high, they might drown out there. So you have to be aware of the tides and what causes the tide. It's the movement of the moon. You say, how does the moon affect the earth like that? Because the moon has gravity. And people who don't believe in gravity, the pull, the force of one body upon another body, it's like a magnet. The magnet of the moon, the gravity of the moon, pulls the water that it rises higher. When the moon passes over, it pulls the water level higher each night. And when the moon goes to the other side of the earth, it affects the tides over there, and the tide on our side goes back to the normal level. When the moon comes back the next night, it pulls the tide high again. You can actually follow the tide right around the world. As the moon moves around, the tide gets higher and it follows the moon. So, can you imagine just the moon? The moon is quarter the size of the earth. Can you imagine if another heavenly body, bigger body, like one of those bigger planets, or the so-called planet X, if it moves close to planet Earth? I'm speculating because we don't know what will happen to cause the earth to be completely devastated so in the last days. But I will tell you this. The Bible says the earth is going to be broken down and it will reel to and fro like a drunken man. In other words, the world is going to be tossed to and fro in space, and something is going to happen to drag it out of its line. So it may very well be that the whole surface of the earth will be breaking up. There are going to be earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, tidal waves. The whole planet is going to be breaking apart in those last days. And so we already see it beginning to happen. Right now, the earth is breaking up. That's why you're having more and more earthquakes. Every time there's an earthquake, the surface of the earth is moving. Nobody on this planet is safe in an earthquake. It's a whole planet, the whole earth moving. We're like little ants on top of this huge moving mass. In different places, sometimes you hear about the earth opening and houses being swallowed. It's happening. It's happened several places in America and different parts of the world. The earth opening and swallowing houses. So Jesus warned about this, and he says it was a sign of the last days. And why? Because the planet is breaking apart. As the Spirit of God is being grieved away from this planet, as men become more wicked, the protection of God is not so strong on the planet. And so the forces of nature are taking over. Nature without God has no restraint, it goes wild. And so the earth is being broken apart. And the only people who have any special protection, I believe, are the people of God. Anyway, after that very long long drawn out thing. Let me go back to the text. So it says that people will be feeling them for fear, and they are looking at those things that are coming on the earth. Because if you think another planet is coming towards this planet, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? If the earth starts to fall apart, what are they going to do? What are they going to do? They try their craziness, and they think they're going to put up Bill Gates had it in mind to send up something to block out some of the rays of the sun. The height of craziness. Thankfully, some good sense prevail and they change their mind. When the earth is breaking apart, what are they going to do? When hurricanes start to multiply, what are they going to do? They don't know God. Their hearts fail them for fear. And what they try to do, Brother Andrew said they're going to vaccinate against the breaking apart. Yes, Brother Andrew. Those lunatics will probably try to do something like that. But this is the end, because it says, and then shall they see the Son of Man coming in a cloud with power and great glory. And that is where Jesus says, and when these things begin to come to pass, then look up and lift up your heads, for your redemption draweth nigh. All right. So the last part of this prophecy speaks about how we ourselves should prepare for this. And I had intended to speak about that this week, but because I went to Luke 21, I actually didn't touch it at all. So we will go back to it next week, actually. Apparently, we have to do that. So, because I would like us to talk a little bit about our preparation, because it's one of those places where Jesus warns. I'll just read one of the warnings that I would like to spend some time looking at. In verse 34, Jesus says, take heed to yourselves, lest at any time your hearts be overcharged with surfeiting and drunkenness and the cares of this life, and so that day come upon you unawares. I want to spend more time talking about that, but as it is, the time is basically gone for this evening, so I'm going to suspend the rest of the passage and wait until next week. We will look at that.